Thanks. Hi everyone. So I'm David. I'm based at the Centre for Landscape Regeneration at University of Cambridge, which is a large interdisciplinary project with lots of natural science focused, and then I'm coming at it from a sociological, social science perspective, and we're exploring particularly the role of communities and how they might engage in or lead on landscape regeneration. But for this presentation, I'm going to talk about a project that I was previously involved in called the Just Scapes Project, which was a collaborative interdisciplinary European project. So looking at just transformations to sustainability in Europe and drawing out some key lessons there. So I'll begin by outlining some of the background and then the project aims, and then going into some of the case studies and methods before discussing the Just Transformations framework and some of the findings from the Scottish case study. So just as a background, we were thinking on this project about just transition of the land and how landscape might be transformed and how that might relate to environmental justice concerns. And it's sort of drawing from the idea that there's going to be and is ongoing profound repurposing of rural areas in response to various different factors and drivers, but particularly climate change mitigation and adaptation, and different environmental and net zero policy targets covering, afforestation, rewilding, landscape regeneration, reduction in livestock grazing. And this is looking at sort of a European scale. And that presents, of course, opportunities and risks for rural communities. And these landscape changes will then be, unevenly experienced and contested. And there's the potential that it could lead to perpetuating further inequalities and injustices if not sort of managed in the right way. And that's all entwined with, power and land inequalities. And as Lawson and Koth has put it, who decides what kind of transformations needed of what and for whom? And we drew from the idea in this project about justice barriers. So there being barriers to the successful implementation of landscape transformation and to meeting, climate change targets particularly, but other kind of environmental policy aims as well. And that these barriers are grounded in, justice claims and sort of conflicts relating to justice. And the idea being that these, environmental policies and initiatives are likely to be undermined or contested if they're perceived to be unfair, or if people's needs are not being met, or, there seem to be, the initiatives seem to be illegitimate or not have that kind of democratic basis, all kinds of things like that, which might impede a project from progressing. And on the other side, there's increasingly strong evidence that inclusive and respectful restoration practices, and this is looking sort of across the world really, especially those involving local leadership and community-led projects, are associated with better outcomes in terms of both social and environmental aspects. And there's a whole degree of involvement there that you can think about, where the greater the degree of involvement from the communities generally leads to these better outcomes. So in terms of the aims of the project, it was particularly aimed to advance understanding of how to envision and enact just transformations of European rural landscapes in response to climate change. As I mentioned, it was interdisciplinary, explored societal dimensions of rural transformations and how rural communities in Europe perceive the injustices arising from either ongoing land use transformations or potential, because this kind of varied across the case studies, whether what stage different initiatives and interventions were at. But it was kind of, thinking now and in the future. And it adopted particularly an empirical environmental justice approach by investigating what kind of claims about justice were emanating from different stakeholders, and it really incorporated a whole range of different stakeholders there across the 3 case studies. So it was looking at Scotland for one, France and the Czech Republic, and there were different case study teams involved in looking at these different case studies and projects, and 4 universities collaborating on that. And so I was looking at the Scotland side of things, and our research questions mainly related to these 2 kind of key ones. What does environmental justice and injustice look like in rural Europe in an age of climate-influenced landscape transformations? And how might these injustices act as sort of barriers to the realizations of just transformations in rural Europe? And we did research and analysis which kind of was both case study centric and sort of deeper dives onto the case studies, but then cross-case kind of comparative research as well. And it particularly focused on these 3 sites, which I'll go through now. But I'll kind of give a very sort of brief overview of the three case studies. But firstly, there was the French Pyrenees in the Aric Valley, which is an area where there's historic and continuing importance of livestock farming to the economy and geography of the area, and a kind of history and connection to open landscapes. And you have the importance of EU CAP subsidies in supporting this ongoing livestock farming. But then you have, on the other hand, sort of pockets of kind of like agroecological projects and food sovereignty movements, and different sort of perspectives on the land and landscape values there, and consensus around support for livestock farming being sort of challenged by rewilding discourses in recent years. And then in the Czech Republic, South and East Moravia, this is a region where agricultural production, wine production is particularly important. But you have sort of long histories of an ongoing landscape trends of large monoculture fields and kind of industrial agricultural practices, and a sense of deep detachment from the land, and a domination by large cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, and emergent policies around kind of alternative land uses and land tenure that we've heard about earlier, but there being sort of structural challenges to sort of implementing and progressing with these. Yeah, and in Scotland, we looked at, we focused on what we call the African tail area, which was broadly related to the Czech Highlands restoration, landscape restoration initiative by the NGO Trees for Life, a landscape level approach through a cluster of landowners, managers and users. So you can see that covered many hectares of land, and this related to, recent push for landscape restoration in Scottish Highlands, and land-based investments sort of emerging around, rewilding or kind of other kinds of green investments, and then related to kind of a wider conflicts that there are around the landscape. Very just briefly, our methods were kind of comparative across the 3 case study sites, and they covered in-depth interviews with a whole range of different stakeholders that you can see there on that list, and also participatory workshops as well, where we kind of did co-creation and co-development of plans and different outputs. And this had its, as I mentioned, had a case study focus to it. But then we also had developed a common analytical framework for understanding the key environmental justice issues across the 3 sites. And we sought to draw out, cross-case justice claims, despite the very different contexts and, land economies and politics and everything that you could think of, I suppose, across the 3 contexts. And we thought, what are the common justice threads there? And I won't go into sort of all of these now, but just to bring out a couple of examples: unequal access to land, You had in different forms highly concentrated ownership of land, whether estate owners in Scotland, larger livestock farmers in France, or large agricultural cooperatives in the Czech case, and unequal. Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, unequal access to land here was not only discussed as a barrier to social justice, but also in relation to the potential for sustainability. So this also covered kind of structural barriers to addressing and building towards landscape transformations. So just to very briefly mention that there are other cross-cutting justice themes here relating to urban to rural burden shifting, fears over restriction of livelihoods, displacement of landscape values and priorities. And that related also to different perspectives that they were on land use and landscape values between often longer standing land users and more newcomers to the area. And I'm going to skip this last one, but just to point out that there was a paper that we published last year, sort of drawing these different justice themes together. And I'm happy to also discuss these after in more detail. I'm going to, just highlight here briefly with the time I have about just transformations of the landscape, and what we did in the Scotland case was particularly think about sort of the diverse meanings and scope of just transitions, and contrasting a shallower just transition with a deeper just transformation to sustainability, which would emphasize the need for more sort of systemic change and addressing the underlying drivers of nature degradation, and would confront the more root causes. And we engage with this in our workshops as well through system mapping, and look to identify what was really sort of driving some of the key issues. And you can think about that through this iceberg model. We've got kind of a set of observable outcomes, sort of surface level issues, you might say, that might be typically addressed, but then drawing down into addressing what are the patterns of inequity and more sort of structural issues. And then you can even think about sort of knowledge, knowledge domination and beliefs in society as well. We particularly had a focus in the Scotland case on integrating community revival with ecological restoration, so how these two might be combined. And just with sort of the last minute or so that I probably have, in the Scotland case study findings, we explored local people's sense of injustice and found that this really related to these deeper questions and structural issues around transformations of the rural landscapes. People talking about they don't want the model of previous generations to kind of repeat again. And we drew out a number of aspects of just transitions of land here that are probably a kind of less focused on typically, less observed, certainly in policies and in other ways. We sought to sort of highlight that these were important from local people's perspective in thinking about just transition of land, whether it be historical redress, and also landscape level distribution of benefits, widening democratic involvement of communities, and recognition justice. So just very briefly, the historical redress particularly pertained to people thinking about justice in a restorative sense, and particularly with relation to the Highland clearances, and that really shaped how people felt about just transition of the land, and that kind of we felt that needed to be addressed as part of a kind of a visioning of the future. And then landscape level redistribution of benefits, thinking about how communities could benefit from restoration programs and initiatives, but in a kind of thinking more beyond the very specific community affected across a landscape level, and then thinking about benefits also in a more holistic sense, and how these might relate to challenges, like more profound challenges around jobs, housing, security for Scottish rural communities. And then going beyond like what's typically looked at in terms of community engagement and participation, to think about democratic gaps for Scottish communities as well, rural areas who otherwise feel kind of locked out of decisions and that kind of thing. And then finally, yeah, recognition justice, meaning here people's landscape values and sense of connection to the landscape, and kind of, yeah, ongoing identities and place-based identities as well that inform how they feel a just transition might be in the future. So kind of just to highlight here some of these sort of deeper, what we suggested are deeper issues around just transition of the land. But yeah, and we also published this paper recently around looking at a transformative approach to just rural transitions, where these were discussed quite in depth. So I'll leave it there and just to briefly mention that we did publish some guidelines as well on socially just landscape restoration in the Highlands that kind of looked at outlining some of these approaches to justice and just transitions, but then identified some concrete outcomes and issues that had drawn out from our workshops. So I'll leave it there and say, thank you very much.